Cars with high redlines are some of the coolest and most unique vehicles ever sold. Think of the Honda S2000, the Porsche GT3 RS, the Lexus LFA, and the Aston Martin Valkyrie, just to name a few. Having an engine that revs to 8,000 or 9,000 RPM really helps set these cars apart from their competition. And in the upcoming automotive landscape, I'm predicting that we're going to see more and more of these types of engines make their way into high-performance sports cars. But before we dive into that theory, first we need to go over why automotive engineers and car enthusiasts alike might enjoy these high RPM screamers. For the purpose of this video, we'll say a car that can rev above 8,000 RPM would be considered high-revving. Feel free to argue about that below. So why even design an engine to rev high in the first place? Well, it's all about horsepower. See, horsepower is equal to torque multiplied by RPM, all divided by a constant. So since there's two variables you can change, there's basically two ways to make horsepower with a naturally aspirated engine. Option 1 is to increase displacement and rev to a standard redline. Think of Chevy's LS, for example. Option 2 is to just keep the displacement standard and just simply rev the engine higher. Think of Honda's K20 or F20C, for example. Obviously, there's some nuance here, but automakers will typically pick one of these two or go somewhere in the middle, as increasing both displacement and RPM can lead to a hit to reliability. But that doesn't explain why people enjoy high-revving engines. Aside from just being in cars that are already cool, there are some features of this engine type that draw people towards them. For one, there's the sound. You can pretty much take any engine configuration out there and improve the sound simply by revving it higher. Just listen to the sound of a NASCAR versus a similarly sized, similarly laid out truck V8. This is in part because revving higher creates a smoother tone, as there's less time in between each exhaust pulse, so it sounds more like the engine is simply outputting one note as opposed to a bunch of little explosions. There's also the additional driver engagement it brings to the table. Driving a car with a power band way up in the rev range feels much more rewarding when you select the right gear to keep the engine in that power band. It's kind of like driving a manual. It's not technically faster, but it keeps the driver working to extract the most performance out of their car. Enough about the theory though. Let's get into why I think more and more of these engines will find their way into sports cars in the coming years. First up, why small high-revving engines kind of aren't that great. Weird aside, I know, but I promise it'll make sense. Engines that can rev to the moon tend to not have that much low-end torque, and as a result suffer heavily in everyday driving. Two motors I mentioned earlier, the K20 and the F20C, actually both received revisions that bumped up the displacement and decreased the redline due to buyer feedback. But what technology is great at providing maximum torque at any RPM? That's right, electric motors. Combine a rev-happy engine for the canyons with some electric motors for around town driving, and you have the recipe for a car that's both efficient and has a little bit of a personality. Another reason is that raising the redline can do wonders to help the optics of downsizing engines. For example, the new C8 Z06 is powered by a 5.5-liter V8. That's still a pretty big engine, but it's also the smallest displacement engine that's been offered in a Corvette in the last 40 years. If Chevy had, for example, just dropped displacement and maybe added a supercharger to make more power than the base model's 6.2-liter, fans might have been a little underwhelmed. But instead, they changed the internal engine layout and made it rev to 85,000 RPM. And all of a sudden, nobody was really bothered that it might be a little smaller than before. Obviously, the Z06's engine wasn't actually downsized with efficiency in mind, but the same principle could be applied to other cars as well. The other thing to note is that the horsepower wars are over, and the car enthusiasts have won. It's never been easier to walk into a dealership and buy a brand new car with 600, 700, even 800 horsepower. And this is awesome, don't get me wrong. I love going fast. But having unlimited horsepower on tap at all times can lead drivers to feeling kind of numb to it. As a result, I think manufacturers of sports cars will begin to focus more on the overall experience of a car, rather than simply how fast it can go in a straight line. Is the GT3 RS the outright fastest or most powerful Porsche 911 you can buy right now? No, that would be the Turbo S. But the GT3 RS is much more loved by car enthusiasts. It just has that aura about it. It sounds great, it's dedicated track weapon, and I think people kind of love the experience that comes with it rather than the numbers. Other manufacturers have to be seeing this trending and are definitely taking notes, because it's already happening. Look at the upcoming Lamborghini Temerario. All 3 points I just mentioned are present in that car. Electric motors for low-end torque, a downsized engine that revs to the moon, and a lot of the press release about it focuses way more on the emotion of the car rather than the performance numbers themselves. So far, it seems to be just the Temerario and a handful of hypercars that follow this mold, but I'm pretty confident that more and more manufacturers will follow suit. But what do you think? Does that make sense for a potential future, or am I just grasping at straws here? Let us know down below. And if there's a high-revving car that we didn't mention that you love, feel free to comment that as well.